All right, looks like we're live. Welcome, everybody. I'm Mike Black, and this is the Page Black Leadership Series. We're every Thursday, and what I do is I bring in experts. It's either a panel or an individual expert, and we talk about solutions to challenges that business leaders in the middle market face. This month, we're talking about revenue enablement. And if you haven't heard the term or you haven't seen our previous episodes, what revenue enablement is really this idea that, well, one, everything in the business should support revenue and sales, because if you don't have sales, you don't have a business. The second part of it is looking for alignment between customer experience, between sales, and between marketing. And so today I'm actually talking about chief of staff, and your question has to be, what the heck were you talking about chief of staff with revenue enablement? We will get into that because I do believe bringing in a chief of staff, especially after some of the conversations that I've had with Keziah, that it really could be valuable in terms of revenue enablement, especially in a smaller company. So if you're looking to more kind of enter the middle market, and Keziah can correct me if I'm wrong on that. So we are going to get started in just 1 second. Let me do a quick introduction to explain why you ought to listen. Keziah Wonstolen, I keep saying that wrong. She left a 14-year management consulting career at Accenture, and she was a chief of staff at Accenture, and she had us focus specifically on sales enablement. Mm-hmm. She started Van & Chief of Staff in 2020, and they provide chiefs of staff to scaling businesses and train. She also trains people to take on a chief of staff role. She lives here in Denver with her husband and 3 kids under 7, so we know she's busy. And if they're under 7, if we hear interruptions, we have no problem with that. All right, but let's get started with our first question. Oh, sorry. Let me introduce myself quickly. My name is Mike Black. I'm the CEO, managing partner of Page Black. I'll talk about us more later. We'll get into that in just a second. Let's start with our first question. What is a chief of staff? This is a new term for me. So Keziah, why don't you get us started with that?
Yeah. So hi, everyone. I'm Keziah. Mike already introduced me, but a chief of staff at the very core of it is someone that a CEO can bring on, or any leader, and essentially takes their vision and executes against it at the very simplest form. The chief of staff role historically has been very government focused. So just as a note, the first formalized White House chief of staff was in 1946. And so this role has grown from primarily government focused to then in the late 1990s, early 2000s became more of a private company. Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies started having these chiefs of staff because the benefit that they were showing in from a government leader perspective, private companies CEOs started to see that there is a value in the role. And then we started to see this trend of startups and mid-level companies also having this, and they all come in a little bit of a different way, and the value that they bring is a little bit different in each of these different size companies. And so the 3 components that I see of a chief of staff is that you are an advisor, first of all. So you are someone who's providing strategic support to the CEO, taking their vision and then taking it out of it, kind of being a sounding board for the concepts, helping them sort of articulate and figure out what actually should we do, what should we not do. So there's an advisory component. There's an operator component. So our chiefs of staff at Van are strong operators, because what it is you're taking that vision out of a CEO's head and you're saying, how are we actually going to do this? So starting off with, what's your North Star for the first year, this year, 5 years? What is that vision? Because then we take it and a good chief of staff will go, great, what does that mean for the quarter? Let's have a 4-quarter plan. What does that mean per month, per week? And then it goes down to this daily task activity list of keeping everyone on priority, keeping them focused on what the actual strategic vision of the company is. We call that a rhythm of business, but being a strong operator, and then also being a strong communicator. So advisor, operator, and then a communicator. And the communicator element of it is very important, because a chief of staff is someone that is also kind of an extension of the CEO. You want them to be able to provide the leadership that if you're not in a meeting, they can also do that. You want them to help you with your communications internally and externally. You also want them to be a good communicator with the team. I mean, that's part of this, is how do you help, one of the first things we do when we come on to a client or we start acting as a CEO or chief of staff is we talk to everyone on the team and we kind of start to build relationships, because that helps a good chief of staff execute on a plan. So those are the 3 components that make up what a chief of staff is.
All right. So let's talk. If I'm thinking of kind of a lower middle market, and in my case, because that's such a broad term, it can mean anything. What I just said can mean anything. Let's
Mhm.
talk about, say, companies that are doing between, say, 5 and 20 million in annual revenue. They're not, maybe it's time. What are the signs it's time to bring on a chief of staff in that situation?
So what we found is typically the ones that we find that we add a lot of value in is if you have a CEO and a CFO, you have a team of maybe 4 or 5 people, and you're getting ready to scale, whether that's either you've got product market fit and you're going out for a seed round or your first,
Mhm.
first round of funding. I find that that's a really good time to bring in a chief of staff prior to bringing on a COO. To be honest, I think that's a good first entry point because one, they can help you get organized, help you set up operational processes that then one can help you sell yourself to potential investors to say that we're running a serious business here. We have here are all the operational infrastructure and rigor that we've put in place. So that helps the investor story. And then also, um, it helps to just get ready to scale. I mean, if you are really going to scale and you're going to bring on new talent, you're going to bring on all these new processes and start to get a little bit more sophisticated in how you're operating. It's a perfect time, is what I've seen.
All right. So you're talking about kind of a lot of startups, like, Boulder kind of has a lot of startups, and there's other places. I mean, we have people all over the country. So
Mhm.
I guess my question would be is there a fit for a chief of staff outside the startup? If it's just more of a traditional business, a manufacturing company or construction firm, or is that not such a fit? It should be more just strictly in the startup arena.
No, totally. I mean, I see the value in any sort of situation. If you're a
Right.
leader, I think you could make a business case to having a chief of staff only because it's someone, and I like to differentiate it between an executive or a CEO to have adequate support. They would, ideally, if you're running a 10 million plus business, you have a COO, you have a chief of staff, and you have an EA. And all three of those people are doing different activities. One, an EA is doing your meeting scheduling. They're doing travel flights. It's far more logistics. That's what an EA does. A COO, on the other hand, traditionally has the talent, the operational talent that sits in your organization. They answer to the operational metrics,
Mhm.
and that's their role. Chief of staff then sits in between them as part of that executive support team and really runs any of the strategic initiatives. So anything that crosses over and the C-suite, kind of wraps a ribbon around the C-suite. So things like strategic planning, talent planning, um, the leadership meeting, the board meetings, any sort of things that incorporate the entire leadership team. That's where a chief of staff is a good fit as well.
Okay, so it could be a good fit across all of those.
Yeah.
I guess so if I'm a business leader, I'm a CEO, and I run a $50 million company, and I'm thinking, gosh, I'm struggling at getting some of the things you've talked about done, but I'm thinking about a business coach instead to help me kind of refine that vision. Why would I go with a chief of staff over a business coach, or a business coach over a chief of staff?
I mean, I don't know if we can swear on this interview, but my thing about the chief of staff is we get shit done. I mean, I can't say that, but we get it done. That to me.
That was on LinkedIn. I don't have any idea what's going to happen now, but there you go.
Yeah, we get it done. I mean, that's the thing. Is like you have a business coach. That's awesome. You could probably have a business coach plus a chief of staff, to be honest. But business coach,
Right.
a lot good chiefs of staff can provide that coaching. They can be advisors. But the great thing about most chief of staff profiles, if you're senior enough, you have been an operator. You have
Mhm.
done it. You've seen it happen. You've actually executed on plans. And that's the
Mhm.
biggest difference for me from a business coach to a chief of staff is they'll take that plan that you create together
Mhm.
and they actually manage it. And that looks like creating, what's the rhythm that our leadership team or the company as a whole should meet on to make sure that we're all constantly aligned back to our objectives. Maybe there's a strategic project that has been sitting on your list of things to do for the last 3 quarters. It's not something you could give to an EA or someone more junior. You need someone that can be strategic enough to take that project and actually run with it and complete it. That to me is the biggest benefit is that we just get it done.
Right. So people that I'm talking to that don't have time to work on bringing a marketing company in, you need to bring Keziah in so you can bring me in. There's actually a couple I'm thinking about that with.
For sure.
So we'll have to see how that goes. All right. So then 2 weeks ago, we had the call where it was kind of the panel, and we had Jim Franklin on talking about the CRO role, chief revenue officer, and how he really wants to kind of in that role, he wants to oversee, marketing, customer experience, as well as sales, and make sure that there's alignment there. When I'm wondering, I think Jim would say, hey, bring a CRO in early, of course, because that's kind of his
Mhm.
gig. And you might say chief of staff. What would your argument if Jim said, look, really sales is such a lifeblood of a company, you should start with a CRO over some other things? What would your answer to that be? It's a false debate. Jim's not here to stand up for himself, so I'm trying to stand up for him.
To me, the revenue enablement piece is a perfect example of when we go into companies and you can see as a chief of staff, um, it's an area where there may be a misalignment. And so that's something that you could put the chief of staff on to go, hey, we're seeing kind of maybe some miscommunications between sales, marketing, customer service. How can you help kind of assess that process of the business and kind of go through that, what's the pain points that we're experiencing right now? How do we, how do we actually fix that? How do you bring in the right people to get that done? To me, that's a perfect example of a strategic priority that might happen as you're growing. And then as part of that definition, we might say, hey, here's what we find is the issue. Here's how we're going to propose to solve it. And maybe one of the proposed solutions is you need to bring on a CRO. I mean, a lot of the times we kind of come into these scaling companies and the chief of staff operates as a generalist executive because they've got that experience. They've seen companies run, and you kind of plug in and you're able to then say, and as we grow, okay, now's the time to bring on the chief people officer. Now's the time to bring on the CRO. That's where I see us fitting in the revenue enablement.
Oh, that's interesting. All right. That brings up something. So I totally did not predict that answer. I thought you were going to say it's more operational struggles is when you should do that. And then, if not, there's that. So, all right. Very good. Thank you, April, for sharing that. I don't know if you can see that because we just shared some of your profile stuff. I guess, let me think about my next question here. Yeah. So what's the difference if I'm a skeptical CEO and I'm thinking, I know you said there's kind of this trifecta of like you could have an executive assistant, but if I'm a skeptical CEO going, hey, maybe I can bring in an executive assistant who has a little bit more experience and they're going to help me get over that and solve these problems instead of kind of going the full route with a chief of staff.
Yeah, I mean, there's tiers of chiefs of staff and their experience for sure. And that may be relevant to the size of the company, but the way I see it, and there's a really awesome HBR article about this, but the way we talk about it in Bannon is there's like kind of level 1, level 2, level 3 type chiefs of staff in terms of their competencies. So level 1 is potentially an EA or an admin type role who's wants to take on more strategic initiatives. And so you're still doing a lot of the logistics, a lot of kind of traditional executive assistance role, and maybe you take on 1 or 2 projects that are on the to-do list. So that's one level. That's someone who the career path is you go from EA to maybe a junior chief of staff type role. Then the middle level is you maybe have a strong manager, an operations manager that you see as potential high potential person that you want to bring up to start to show them a little bit of the organization and help. Then they take on more strategic projects that are more operational focused. So that's a really good opportunity to bring people up into the organization as well. And so then there's that mid-level, and then there's the senior chiefs of staff. These are people who have run and been a chief of staff in other organizations. They have been a COO, and maybe they're going to become a chief of staff because they want to be a bit more strategic. They want to be an individual contributor, not a talent, manager of the operations team. So those to me are the 3 levels. And to answer your question I think your question was what would you bring them in for?
You answered my question really is like, I was saying, why not, it sounds like if it's a smaller company, maybe it makes more sense to bring in an executive assistant who could take on, has some business acumen, who could do that. I know you trained for that as well. We'll do a quick plug for you there. Yeah. And then at the higher level, you're going to want somebody that just has done this work before, because it's going to be just easier for them to, like, from a time to execution, I'm guessing it's going to take them a lot less time to figure out how to accomplish whatever the strategic initiative is. Is that fair?
Right. The thing I love about the role too, it is an opportunity to keep high performers engaged. So maybe you have someone who is a high performer in a siloed piece of your organization, and you go, I really want to start to transition them into a more leadership role. I mean, what better training ground to bring someone in to be the right hand of the CEO to actually see how the entire business is run. So from there, you could then take them in that training, give them that role. Typically, a chief of staff role is a good one is 12 to 18 months. At that point, you want to say, hey, now where could we go from here? And what happens is usually they go in to run a head of operations, a COO role, head of a business unit. they then, that experience as a chief of staff gives them the kind of the more strategic view of the company, and I think gives great context for them then to move on as leaders within the company.
All right. So if let's just go. Actually, I don't have time. Darn it. Okay, we'll get into it next time, another time. All right, really quickly, we are going to do a quick round of marketing communication support with Paige Black. As a communications firm, we really do three things. We come in for companies that are struggling with marketing. They've tried SEO, they've tried this, they've tried that, and they just really haven't gotten the momentum. They're not reaching their goals. We come in and we do three things. We look at what they're good at. We look at what's important to their best customers, and we look at what their competition's talking about. And based on that triangulation, we build a marketing strategy, a tactical plan, messaging, and all of that to help them reach their goals. Second area we work with is in sales pipeline support, I call it. And really what that means is they're not closing really big deals that they believe they should be closing. We'll go in and do some research, interview people they've lost deals with, interview people they've won deals with, and figure out how they can win more of those deals. Third area is strategic internal communications or employment brand. We will go in and help companies with their recruitment and retention. From a communications perspective, we are not an HR consulting firm. All right, enough said about this. It is this month, we are talking about revenue enablement. I'm excited to have Keziah on because she has experience in sales enablement. And I know she's looked at this, and I think alignment's a critical component. So I just want to hear more about how a chief of staff could support revenue enablement from your perspective.
Yeah. Yes. So like we were saying before, to me, this is something that is wrapping a ribbon around kind of siloed areas of the organization. I know that, we talked about this a few weeks ago about the CRO taking on that role. But what I see as, in the interim, if you don't have a CRO, as chief of staff could be a person that could help kind of coordinate across those three organizations. To me, the first thing to do would be to look at your marketing, sales, and customer support groups. You would do it's traditional kind of consulting assessments, right? It's taking a look at what's happening today, where are the main pain points, how you propose to fix that. And I think all of this is solving for the customer journey. And so something that we always talk about before we do any process improvements or process assessments or anything like that is talking about what the customer journey is, what do we want it to be, and then talking about marketing, sales, and customer service, and how do we support that as part of it. And then just taking it and going, okay, well, here's what we need to change. And then an element of that is actually getting it done. Going back to, okay, now I've identified, here are the things that we need to do to actually build this revenue enablement team. What does that look like from a change management perspective? Who needs to be trained? Who needs to kind of up their competencies, because we're building towards this more collective enablement team. That's also something that, from a competency role of a chief of staff, a change management background is highly important. It's something we hire for, because I think a lot of this stuff is when you change operational processes or anything within a business, having that change management communication background is really important.
Right. The second you're making changes, people go into kind of a threat state, are uncomfortable, and then their performance drops because their brain is offline. Bring that in from a different background we already talked about. So if I think of where we see challenges, I'm thinking of, we were brought into a firm, and I'm just specifically, we were brought in because we're really struggling with their digital marketing. The leads, they're getting lots of leads but not a lot of good leads, right? So sales is like, the quality is terrible. It's 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 of these inbound leads that are really a good fit for us. And so we came in, they said, like, hey, can you help us resolve this? And so, of course, I go in and I'm looking and I'm like, and I understand, as I look at this company and what they're good at, I'm realizing that there's a misalignment around the way that their marketing advertisings work. So I interviewed a salesperson just saying, hey, tell me about what a good lead looks like. Tell me, what are your ideal clients? Tell me the industries you want to work in. And there's this disconnect, right? And that's where this fundamentally comes from, is that what marketing is advertising against is not what sales is telling me. Of course, I also reviewed their strategic initiatives, and I'm not a chief of staff, but I just wanted to look at all of these things. So if you were to come into a firm like that, where they've got this struggle and it's really like they're spending this is a small firm. I think they're doing about 5 million this year. Their advertising budget on an annual basis is about 250 in the digital only area. And they're just not hitting their growth goals on that. How would you, if you were brought in as a chief of staff, how would you take that on?
I mean, to me, it always goes back to the strategic priorities. I always ask, what's your North Star or what's your goal for the year? And that, I mean, we're all running businesses, so it's always around what's your revenue targets. So I always want to see what the revenue targets are for the year, and then what does that mean per quarter? Um, and so to me, then you build around. I think you build around that, and it's all about enabling sales. It's all about enabling revenue, because that's the most important thing. So that's where I start, and then you go back from there. And then I think always understanding what the customer is looking for is really important too. So as part of that sales process, how are you enabling your salespeople to better have those conversations with the customer? But always go back to what's the vision,
Right on.
and the revenue.
Yeah, they have that, but it's not. So this company in particular, I'm just going to continue with this example. They have that. They've got a decent vision around what they want to do. They have growth goals. They've got revenue goals. But it's not being reflected across the entire organization. There's just this misalignment. They're getting leads that are they're frankly a better fit for me than they are for them, which is fascinating. When I dig into the account, I'm like, oh, there's an opportunity for me here, but I don't understand why they're here at all. And they're in the industry a little bit. So, but it really is very different. How would you begin to kind of overcome those? Like, I know I'm thinking more process wise. I get you've done this assessment. You've looked at where their strategic initiatives are. What's your next step?
I mean, then I'd go into what's the problem with the leads, right? Like, what is it? Is it the wrong customer? Is it the wrong size? I mean, what is the issue? Like, that would be my first thing, is like, but then also, what's the ideal? They must know the ideal customer. And so I think starting with that, and really then changing how your inbound is coming in. I mean, that's the first thing, but really understanding, what does an ideal customer look like? You know that for marketing.
No, that's what I'm doing with them.
What does it look like? And then changing your marketing approach to better capture those leads, and then consistently having we talked a little bit about this when we had Jim on the phone, but it's how do you align? It's all great to say we have a revenue enablement team, but what does that actually mean? Because people still will work in silos unless you purposely bring them together, whether it's a daily sprint call with everybody on there. And also making sure that their metrics are aligned, so that once you do change that lead, you define the ideal lead, and you start to create that, generation, the lead generation into the sales team. Do they know what they're supposed to be doing? Are they enabled to be able to go have the right conversations now that you're focused on the ideal customer? And then from a customer success side, do they know what they're responsible for? Because I think that's also a team that's always left out, because they're responsible for 90% of the renewals of your revenue. So you have to enable them just as if they were a salesperson.
Right. To support the entire customer journey, really. It's a life cycle. So sometimes when I'm having this is not true for Jim, but sometimes when I'm having conversations with salespeople and we're starting to get into this level of engagement, one of the struggles I see is that a lot of times sales leaders are really focused on, how do I change behavior? And the number one lever they use is like, where we're going to pay people differently based on that. And I think for salespeople, there's a lot that actually really works well for people who want to be in sales. They're in sales because they want to make more money. So you incent them, they're going to go after whatever you incent them for, is my experience. I don't find that to be true as much with customer success or customer enablement, and nor do I find it as marketing. I think that there's a piece of that. So what are your thoughts about how do you not only do you have disparate functions, you have different, like what good marketing looks like is different than what good sales, even though they need to be integrated and collaborative in terms of what they're doing, and aligned, I guess is the word I'm looking for. How do you start to look at, if you see a company struggling with that, how would you dig into that?
I think it's
really culture, I think.
Totally. Well, it's culture, but it's also aligning some people call them OKRs, but it's kind of metrics. Are we all focused on the right metrics? And then what does that mean for them individually? I think it definitely should change. I think the revenue team should have the same metrics collectively that they're all trying to shift. But then when it goes down to individual teams, it's got to be a bit more customized. And what do they find as incentive? And that's something that it's different, like you said, but there has to be an overarching metric that we're all working towards. But I also think it helps to have a little bit less of the metric side, but more of the vision. I mean, you could say the same thing, right? We talked about earlier, right? Well, what's the North Star of the company, but maybe what's the North Star of the revenue team, and how does that play out across their strategic priorities? And then start to talk about, like, how do we want to, I always think it goes back to the customer. How do we want to be seen by the customer, and creating this vision, and that then trickles down into becoming the culture of that team. But then But then, of course, you have to have metrics that support that. You can't just have a great idea and not have any sort of metrics to help them drive what they're supposed to be doing.
Sure. So get the vision. Essentially, you're now back to the original part of our conversation. You've got the vision from, say, the executive team, the CEO, translating that down into what does that look like from a team perspective? What is how does the marketing team support that vision, and how do we present that vision to the marketing team? Same thing with sales, same thing with customer success or enablement.
Right. And showing them
then
how they're all
do
a
that.
part of it. Yeah. I mean, that to me is super important. But then it's also creating this rhythm where you're constantly checking in to see the progress of those metrics and how are we doing towards our strategic priorities. That also breaks down a lot of the barriers that we have in traditional going from, the siloed marketing, sales, customer service to these revenue enablement teams. You're breaking that down a bit.
Yeah, for sure. No, I like that. And I love the idea of like, we're going to measure them all slightly differently, but the overarching goals are going to be similar.
Yeah.
So that makes a ton of sense for me. So, all right. All right, folks, that is it for today. So we will talk about next week. Thank you, Keziah, for joining me today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. And next week, it is Revenue Enablement Series this month. And so we are going to be talking, one of the key pieces that is customer experience. And so we're going to talk with Mike Bowers, and he is a passionate person in CX. He calls it CX. And then actually he will get into, I'm sure, knowing Mike, employee experience leading to customer experience. So that'll be 10 o'clock Mountain, 9 a.m. Pacific, and then noon Eastern. And so I hope you can make it. Everybody have a great week.